This week on the agenda, critical minerals, how rare earth metals are the latest geopolitical battleground, and who's winning the race to fuel the future. Critical minerals are used in the high-tech manufacturing sector to make things like robots, wind turbines, drones, electric cars, and even weapons. Governments around the world consider them essential to the green energy transition and national security. Deposits of these minerals, like rare earths, lithium and cobalt, can be found on most continents, but they're tricky and expensive to get out of the ground. China has consistently invested heavily in mining, refining and processing critical minerals at home and internationally. The focus was on building self-sufficiency. Now, China controls a significant portion of critical minerals supply chains. While global demand surges, the International Energy Agency forecasts demand will triple by 2030 and quadruple by 2040. Driven by concerns about supply chain vulnerabilities and geopolitical tensions, the US is trying to reduce its dependence on China for critical minerals by boosting domestic production. The EU is spending $24 billion to diversify its critical minerals supply, including 13 new strategic raw minerals projects outside its borders. The UK has published a strategy to enhance its domestic capabilities in mining and processing. Australia, Canada and other nations have launched major funding programmes, and resource-rich countries have been working to retain more value from their mineral resources. In a world of high geopolitical tensions, critical minerals have emerged as critical to safeguarding global energy and economic security. Joining me now are Julie Michelle Klinger, Associate Professor of Geography at the University of Delaware and author of Rare Earth Frontiers, and Henry Sanderson, Associate Fellow at the Royal United Services Institute. Julie, let me start with you, and let's talk about what are the most geopolitically significant critical minerals and why.
Right, that's an excellent question. Chances are, if a mineral is included on a critical list, it's been deemed geopolitically significant for whatever that nation or political bloc, whatever their interests may be. So the ones that people are most familiar with likely include lithium, cobalt, and nickel. These are crucial because they're important not only for energy technology, but also for defense and a whole host of other technological applications. A number of rare earth elements, not all of them, are also included in critical minerals or critical raw material lists. And this is for the same reason. It's because they play a crucial role in a whole host of technologies across multiple sectors.
And Henry, how has China's control over processing and refining capabilities helped shape the global critical minerals landscape?
Yeah, so China really dominates the processing and refining of metals and minerals. And this is a critical step into turning something that's dug out of the ground into a usable product. And its share is generally around 60–70%. And case of copper, around 50% of smelting is done in China. So this means that no matter where the mineral is mined in the world, dug up in the world, it's almost always sent to China, where it's processed. And then once it's processed in China, it often stays within China and gets turned into final products. And China actually has regulations that make it not cost effective to re-export minerals once they're processed outside of China. So having that step in the supply chain is really beneficial for China.
Julie, China has spent decades building that world's main industrial chain for mining, for processing critical minerals. Do you think that's more of an inward or an outward strategy?
I would say that it's both. Certainly in the early years of the People's Republic of China, it was definitely an inward strategy for self-reliance to move away from dependence and vulnerability on hostile foreign powers, something that might sound may be strikingly familiar in a very different context today. But then following China's open up and reform, it then became a much more outward focused strategy as well, in order to increase China's market presence. But also this was an outward looking development strategy that was robustly supported by funding from all over the place, from Japan's overseas development aid to the World Bank, et cetera. And so really building China into the industrial platform for the world was much of the world's development strategy from the 1980s and through the 1990s. And so now we can see how both the inward and the outward aspects of China's industrial development strategy are kind of working together, as China has been working to move itself up the value-added supply chain and processing chain for rare earths and other critical raw materials, while working on providing many venues to overseas locations for, we might say, the mining or less value-added processing aspects of its industrial capacity.
We've been talking about why some of these metals, these rare metals, are critical and their geopolitical significance. I mean, Henry, that's why recently they've been at the very heart of talks between China and the United States in Geneva and London. And China's now agreed to approve export applications for rare earth minerals. How big a breakthrough is that?
I mean, it's still to be seen because we don't know all the details of this deal that was struck between China and the US and exactly what the US has agreed to ease restrictions on. China said it will start to allow exports of rare earth permanent magnets. But they still have this leverage. They can stop exports at any point. And also there's reports of the system they put in place requiring ever more detail on where these magnets are going, who the customers are. So China's not stepping away from keeping this leverage over the global market. And from the US side, yes, they've scored an immediate relief for their automotive and other industries. But what actually is the longer term strategy here? What are they trying to achieve from this deal? Because if Chinese magnets are just allowed back in, there will be less incentive to develop a new industry in the US.
Julie, I can see you nodding away there. I wonder to what extent you agree. I mean, do you think that China has the edge here when it comes to global trade negotiations because of where it is with critical minerals?
Well, I think in terms of the infrastructure and the capacity, China absolutely has the edge. But I think with this larger series of events with the export restrictions and then a deal to ease the export restrictions, I think that actually reflects the phenomenal pressure felt on both sides or directed on both sides toward the national level administrations by the transnationally embedded business interests, right? So it hurts sellers in China to have their product parked that should be destined for the United States, just as it hurts buyers in the United States to not have access to the materials that they are interested in. However, this trade deal, it does ease tensions in the near term, but it really doesn't change the structural dynamics. And so insofar as the US ambition is to build up its own mine-to-magnet supply chain, actually the export restrictions were a little bit of a favor to that segment of the supply chain. To the downstream users, of course, not so much.
So Henry, what do you think? Do you think it's a pipe dream? Can the US or anyone else catch up or overtake China? And how long would it even take?
It's possible, but I think you're going to have to need policy certainty. I mean, the US at the moment, every 4 or 5 years, the policy switches. And as we're seeing at the moment with this bill going through Congress, there's a lot of uncertainty about what's going to happen to clean energy industries in the US. You just can't invest longer term in an environment of uncertainty and when there's such flip-flopping backwards and forwards. So I think the US really has to decide. There is bipartisan agreement on not wanting China to dominate these supply chains. So what is the policy going to be and how are you going to incentivize domestic production? Because a lot of it comes back to demand. And China is the lion's share of demand for rare earth permanent magnets because its EV market, its electric vehicle market is so big. But Trump wants to bring back manufacturing and reduce reliance on China, but he's essentially damaging demand for electric vehicles in the US through his policies. So the uncertainty on demand makes it difficult for investment to happen. But of course, the US can do it. It's going to take a bit of time, but it also depends on what the demand in the US is going to be in 2030, 2035.
Julie, what do you think? Can anyone catch up or overtake?
The thing that I would like to add to that is, I've been really struck over the past decade and a half, actually, by the continuities across administrations. And there's a couple of different kinds of continuities. One of them has to do with the fact that there is a kind of persistent lack of industrial coordination, right? So whether rare earth permanent magnets are destined for renewable energy technologies or whether they're destined for military technologies, in either case, we've seen nowhere near adequate investment, planning, or coordination in actually building a supply chain for either of those applications. And it's the fact that rare earth permanent magnets do have multiple applications, I think, which highlights another important continuity across different presidential administrations in the United States. So whether the administration is more renewable energy focused or clean energy focused, or whether it's openly hostile to that agenda, the fact remains that rare earth permanent magnets are used in EVs, in a host of renewable energy technologies, and they are also used in a host of weapons systems as well. And so that continuity, I think, is important to keep in mind when we consider whether it's possible to catch up, what kind of planning is required, and all of that.
Well, we've been talking about the two biggest economies in the world, haven't we? United States and China. But Julie, what about the European Union? That they've recently outlined their own investment plans for rare earth minerals, both within and outside its borders. What do you make of that?
It's interesting, right? On one level, it's important, and I think it's significant to see major consuming economies or political blocs taking more responsibility for meeting their critical raw material needs. But it is unfortunately symptomatic of this global fragmentation that we're seeing that's leading to this kind of scramble to lock down reserves or resources for rare earths and other designated critical raw materials. And there's a couple things that we do know about scarcity and demand forecasts. And one of the things that we do know for sure is that if we have an uncoordinated, fragmented global scramble that is primarily driven by capturing and dominating key resources rather than coordinating to achieve common technological goals, then in fact, we will run into scarcity problems and scarcity-related conflicts.
It's interesting that you call it a scramble. And Henry, I wonder if you agree with that. Is that how you see it? Is it all a little bit too little, too late, that any investment now is clearly going to take years, possibly decades, to even come to fruition?
Yeah, I think in something like rare earths, it is very late in the day, and the West has been aware of China's dominance for many years, and even we helped them. Many companies were sold, or companies invested in China or moved to China. So I think it is quite late in the day to take action. I mean, I think the concept of a scramble for minerals is a bit overdone. There is a lot of tension on these minerals, but one of the fundamental challenges with technology is it's moving very fast and changing, and so it's not quite clear what minerals we're actually going to need for something like clean energy in 10 or 15 years time. So that adds an additional layer of uncertainty. And for all the talk about critical minerals and the high profile they're getting, if you actually look at investment announcements, it's not like a lot of money is flowing into this sector, and the market capitalization on the stock market of this sector is not big. So investors aren't that excited either. So I think we need to be realistic about what's going on. And Trump's talk about Greenland or Ukraine, again, these are projects that are going to take many years to come to fruition. And I agree with Julie's point that if you're fragmenting markets, you're going to lead to a lot of inefficiency, perhaps waste of government money, etc. So the best solution is for allied countries outside China to come together to pool their resources more. And this is happening, as you can see from the latest G7 meeting.
I do want to talk about where the investment's coming from. Julie, as Henry's been saying, China has been investing in this sector for far longer than many others. I mean, for example, 15 out of 18 copper projects in the Democratic Republic of Congo are China operated or owned. Do you see that level of investment continuing?
I think it's likely. Right. I think China's overseas investment logic, particularly in the extractive sector, it behaves in some ways that are fundamentally different from other major multinational extractive industries. And one of them is that the strategic vision is to ensure that there is an adequate global supply. Right.
Yeah.
And so and that's quite different from a company that might radically reorganize, sell off, or acquire different segments of its operations depending on quarterly returns, right? So in a way, China's investments tend to weather market volatility in a way that really, firms from outside of China don't quite do in the same way.
We've been talking, Henry, about the DRC. It's recently extended its export ban on cobalt, hasn't it? I mean, what impact is that happening? And do you see other countries taking similar steps?
Yeah, so it's really interesting what they've done. The price of cobalt has increased, I think, by about 10% since the news of the extension, and obviously stockpiles will start to get run down this year. But the fundamental problem with cobalt is the battery market in China has actually moved to use batteries that don't have any cobalt. So around 80% now of the market is lithium-ion batteries without cobalt. So it faces a fundamental change in demand, which goes back to my earlier point about the unpredictability of mineral demand. I think a lot of resource-rich countries are looking to try and get more value add within their countries, and we've seen Zimbabwe sort of ban exports of certain types of lithium so that processing can be built in the country. It's a very hard tactic to get right. I mean, Indonesia is a classic example of a country that's used its nickel to attract processing investment into the country. But it is hard to get right, and you need to have the infrastructure, the other sort of enticements to make sure that it's actually viable to process and build plants in your country. So it's unclear to me, what the DRC is trying to achieve or whether they will achieve it. And also cobalt's mined along with copper in the DRC, so that slightly complicates the supply picture.
There are so many implications for different industries. I wonder, Julie, if you think that industries realise how vulnerable they are, these end-user industries, automakers, defence sector, the renewable energy companies, and all of that. Do you think they realise their potential vulnerability in the future?
Mm-hmm. That's such an interesting question. I have found that there are two very strong opposing tendencies within the different industries that you just mentioned. One is, yeah, absolutely. There are people who have been worried about supply chain disruptions for a long time, not just with respect to China, but with respect to supply chain disruptions for any critical raw material that has a kind of single country origin or potential bottleneck. And these people have been concerned for a long time. On the other hand, you have, the kind of learned experience that comes from the fact that on a day-to-day level, for the most part, most of the time, China and other trading partners are reliable. And so you have these two tensions. You have long-standing concerns and fears over vulnerability. And then you have the kind of operational day-to-day level, which is like, well, okay, there might be a crisis in the future, but for now, things are okay. Or like what we just saw with the export restrictions and then the renegotiation and the lifting of those restrictions, right? So it makes it very difficult in our globalized, fragmented, but globalized market context for firms to actually move practically in a way that makes market sense to hedge against the vulnerabilities that, when seen in a slightly different light, are not bugs, but they're actually features of a diversified and integrated global economy.
So, Henry,
Yeah.
what kind of investment do you think is needed to hedge these vulnerabilities, if you like? I'm thinking particularly for the defense sector.
Yeah, the defense sector obviously needs to develop its own supply chains, and we've seen that to some extent in the US, the Pentagon investing in rare earth supply. I mean, I think overall their demand is quite small, so I think it is possible for them to pay whatever price to develop these supply chains. The bigger concern is the civilian industries, the big industries like robots that's coming, or electric vehicles. You know, they're very price sensitive and cost sensitive. As Julie just said, you know, there is this tension between you know, not wanting to be reliant on China, but then there's the cost implications. And China has been a good supplier, has delivered cost-effective products, rare earth permanent magnets, batteries, etc. So that's the big question, which is, yes, companies now may be willing to pay a premium given actual total restrictions, but when this eases, will they actually be willing to pay a premium because that's going to make them less competitive with other products, especially Chinese products. And what we're seeing is Chinese companies really going global now and actually investing and setting up production in Brazil and Europe and elsewhere. So the competition is only going to get more intense. You're asking a lot of companies to pay a premium to hedge against a geopolitical risk. And we've seen that by the fact that markets have let China gain almost 90% dominance in a lot of these minerals and technologies.
You're making me think of some of that rhetoric that's swirling around. And I wonder what you think, Julie, despite the competition, the increased competition that Henry's talking about, is a full decoupling from Chinese mineral supply chains realistic or even desirable?
I mean, I think decoupling is unlikely and costly. I mean, the nuance that is lost in this kind of China versus the West or China versus the US rhetoric is the fact that the companies that are actually operating in these space, many of these are joint ventures. These are multinational companies. These are companies that have globally diversified investors, which include investors from North America, Europe, and China. And so it's fundamentally against the business interests that form the industrial bedrock of the critical raw material supply chains to decouple from China. That's one thing. The other thing is that, you know, these relationships took, in some cases, decades to build, right? These business relationships and these commercial relationships. And so this rhetoric around decoupling, you know, I think either it is maybe a lot of bluster and not a lot of substance. And I think even in the event that there are formal policies or actions to attempt a formal decoupling or a full decoupling, we'll see what we see with respect to other supply chain restrictions elsewhere, which is that, well, when there is a restriction in exports or imports of material that people need, for lack of a better term, entrepreneurial actors tend to emerge to connect buyers and sellers, right? So with this, I'm adopting a little bit of a wait and see approach. To see what actually happens with global material flows, as opposed to the rhetoric around decoupling.
Bluster or substance, Henry? What do you think?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think the question is, what are companies actually going to do? I agree with Julie, but I do think there is substance, and what's happened this year with the rare earth export restrictions. I think the lesson has has been learned, and I think there will be more of a sustained push to not decouple, but to de-risk and remove some of the risks. Because you've seen this year, automotive companies, others have actually lost money, have actually been caught short by the restrictions. And I think that sort of vulnerability has hit home. So I think there will be a sustained effort to at least de-risk supply chains. If, you know, full decoupling, I don't think is possible.
We've talked about business, we've talked about automotive, we've talked about defence, but these minerals are obviously critical to the green transition, to technological innovation and more. Julie, how do you see the current geopolitical rows over supply chains playing out in the future?
Well, I think unfortunately, we are in a period of record-breaking increases in defense spending across the globe. And so rare earth elements and other designated critical raw materials are not only used for renewable energy technology. Many of them are used in any form of energy generation, renewable or otherwise. And on top of that, many of these are also used in weapons applications. And so, of course, increases in defense spending do have very real ramifications for material flows. Where are the raw materials that are being mined and processed? Where are they going, and where are they ultimately ending up? And well, if the answer is that a larger share of them are ending up in material that's designed to be blown up, that, of course, raises all sorts of concerns around the viability of recycling, recovery, and building a circular economy. It is really difficult to build a circular economy around rare earths or other critical raw materials if this stuff is being sent into war zones to detonate.
Sent into war zones, sent into space. I mean, Henry, what about you? Do you think that the sector can ever really decouple, as it were, from global geopolitical arguments?
No, I think we're entering an age where minerals are going to be geopolitical. Minerals, as Julie said, are critical for defense, critical for pretty much all industries, and especially clean energy. So as fossil fuel demand peaks and then declines, I think the geopolitics of critical minerals are going to define this decade and next decade. Eventually, of course, I'm optimistic. I hope by 2050 we have much more recycling. We can have more of a circular economy, but I think on the way there, we're going to have a lot more need for mining, for processing, and for production of these minerals. And I think this fundamental tension between China and the US, or the West and China, is going to remain. So I don't see the geopolitics going away.
Henry Sanderson, Julie Michelle Klinger, thank you both very much. You can watch every episode of The Agenda in full on CGTN Europe's YouTube channel. And for exclusive extra content from me, my guests and the rest of the team, don't forget to check out @The Agenda Show on TikTok. Coming up on a future agenda, what next for BRICS as leaders gather in Brazil to debate the bloc's next chapter? But for now, from me, Juliet Mann, and from all the Agenda team here in London, goodbye.